Karl Popper. Reason without revolution. Rajeev Bhargava. Popper will be remembered as one of the great philosophers of science in the 20th century. On the other hand, his place as a political philosopher is far less secure. Why? 20 years ago, radical students at university in India were enraged at the very mention of Karl Popper, the influential philosopher who died last month at the age of 92. His was a household name to be scorned at. Wasn't Popper's rationalism too pure to be anything but suffocating? Hadn't Kuhn and Feyerabend, by showing the virtual impossibility of demarcating science from non-science, irreparably damaged his reputation as an eminent philosopher of science? And, in the early days of the Cold War, had he not taken an obdurate anti-Soviet stance? Wasn't he the self-proclaimed enemy of socialism? A Marx baiter? A liberal status quoist who would not admit to differences between fascism and socialism? The collapse of the Soviet system and the gradual erosion of the popular legitimacy of science might force upon us the imprudent conclusion that while Popper's stature as a political philosopher will grow, his reputation as a philosopher of science will decline steadily. Nothing could be further from the truth. 20 years hence Popper will still be remembered as one of the great philosophers of science in the 20th century. On the other hand, his place as a political philosopher is far less secure. Why? All things considered, the plain truth about Popper's political philosophy is that it is a child of its times in a manner that stifles its relevance in other contexts. The political values he instinctively defended will endure, but the formulation that he deployed in their defense, motivated by partisan ideological considerations grounded curiously in the most abstract metaphysical premises, will not. Indeed, its strength was entirely derivative, drawn from the intellectual power of its enemy. Looking back at it, one finds it rather thin and unilluminating on precisely those values of liberal democracy that formed the linchpin of his attack on socialist systems. Besides, it is plagued with other problems. It notoriously misreads Hegel and Marx, the two principal enemies of the open society. Its anti-authoritarian polemic is useful but unlikely to attract those who do not share his metaphysical concerns. True, it draws attention to the dangers of utopianism and extreme perfectionism, but compared to other works in this genre of writing, its apocalyptic, hysterical tone will always be a liability. Let me not be unfair. Popper's general point that mass violence and terror in all forms and under all contexts is a crime against humanity had contextual relevance. He said it precisely when it required urgent statement and with characteristic passion. But intensity of feeling cannot be confused with depth of insight. To have lasting value, a treatise on violence must not only record the horror of slaughter but also tell us why violence continues to be deployed in the defense of the most despicable and exploitative social orders as well as for their overthrow. Failure here binds his work to evanescent ideologies rather than to great philosophies that stand the test of time. Similar ideological single-mindedness muddled Popper's thinking on methodology in social science, where he in holism and political totalitarianism or between individualism and political liberalism. How such a complex and subtle thinker could have established strong, intermeshing connections between politics and methodology has been a source of perennial puzzlement to me. But ideological issues aside, was his defense of methodological individualism justified? Now, methodological individualism is the view that all social phenomena such as class and caste must be explained wholly and exhaustively in terms of attributes such as beliefs, desires, intentions and actions, and more importantly, that such attributes can only be individualistically construed. Which is why rather than explain the social in terms of other social entities, we must, the individualist suggests, look for their explanation in terms of individual phenomena. Popper uncritically accepted this controversial individualist assumption and went on to defend an individualist methodology in the social sciences. But better philosophical sense suggests that equally good if not better arguments exist for the view that beliefs, desires, intentions and actions are inescapably social, so that an explanation couched in their terms is still social rather than individualist. To give explanatory importance to human action is one thing, to believe that this entails a commitment to individualism is quite another. Popper did not appear to distinguish these two issues. So, what made Popper famous? I doubt if the philosophical story of the nature and function of science and an understanding of the features that distinguish it from other human activities can be adequate or complete without a proper grasp of Popper's role in its illumination. Popper's project was to help focus on the internal specificity of science, to demarcate it from non-science. He sought to do so without undermining the role of judgment and imagination in the formation of scientific hypothesis, without relying on a full-blooded, uncompromising notion of truth, and with the help of a non-traditional view of rational, scientific method. Contrary to popular belief and against the grain of what he himself stated in some of his writings, he also granted a fairly prominent role to both history and value in the understanding of scientific activity. Let me elaborate briefly. Before Popper, the nature of scientific method was understood in inductivist terms. The controlled observation of particular instances led to the formation of a hypothesis that required further positive tests for confirmation. A hypothesis is true when supported by positive tests. The goal of scientific activity was the accretion of such true hypotheses. But at the heart of this understanding lay the unsolved problem of induction that generated anxiety and skepticism among scientists and often led them towards mysticism and even irrationalism. What is the problem of induction? Quite simply that no matter how long the list of confirmatory instances, a universal claim can never be derived from it. This means that strictly speaking no scientific hypothesis is ever proven to be true. Even after 1 million white swans are witnessed it cannot be concluded, for example, that all swans are white. Popper's unique solution was to change track here by suggesting that rather than look for further confirmatory instances, the scientist, who may form a hypothesis any which way she pleases, must seek its falsification. His solution rested on a simple logical point, namely, that while no amount of confirmatory instances can fully establish a law, a single counter-example can falsify a law-like claim. It follows that a scientific community must seek to falsify hypothesis, failing which it should conclude that the hypothesis in question is closer to truth than others. Popper called this verisimilitude. Popper believed that the history of any mature science consisted in the gradual accumulation of theories, each succeeding one somehow getting nearer to the truth than its predecessor. Popper also believed that although a scientist uses his powers of imagination and instinct to form the wildest of hypotheses, here no method of discovery exists, a rational scientific method exists to adjudicate between competing hypotheses. In other words, scientists employ a perfectly legitimate logic of validation. Successive failure to falsify a hypothesis increases the degree of its verisimilitude. Let me repeat. Popper never gave up the belief that the world out there had an essential structure waiting to be discovered. He also believed that although the actual process of discovery has no fixed and determinate procedure, there existed a formalizable, rule-sensitive method on which scientists had to rely to know that what they believed to have discovered was really a structural feature of the world. One other move distinguishes Popper's view from traditional conceptions rooted in empiricism. Popper insisted that only publicly observable statements of a certain kind, what he called basic statements, could falsify a hypothesis. This enabled him to take the empirical base of science away from the embarrassing subjectivism in which it was caught. For Popper, observation was not simple sensory experience but a public event to be tested and modified. Observations such as here are the 16 moons of Jupiter are not infallibly given in perceptual experiences, in private sensations. Rather, they are publicly recorded. This made science a public activity. By making critical public tests integral to science, Popper brought philosophy of science closer to the practice of the scientific community. These views of Popper are ridden with problems. For a start, it is simply impossible to test all strongly falsifiable theories. The number of theories we actually select to test is much smaller than the set of all possible theories that are falsifiable. No scientific method determines this prior selection of theories which we bother to test. Philosophers of science like Hilary Putnam have long insisted that to seek formal rules here is impossible or self-defeating. Could Popper accept this criticism, and modify his position by saying that the requirement of a formal method is only a necessary condition for scientific rationality and that in part we must rely on intuition and inarticulable insight? The trouble is that even this conception of scientific method as a mixture of informal insight and formal rules is inappropriate for science. As Popper himself later admitted, this broadened conception does not apply to one of the most influential theories of modern science, i.e., Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. Critics have pointed out that our reasons for accepting Darwin's theory is not because it has passed a Popperian test but because it makes sense of a lot of data and therefore gives us its plausible explanation. It is consistent with what philosophers of science have called inference to the best explanation, grounded precisely in the kind of logic Popper found completely unpalatable. If we attempt to make Popper's scientific method compatible with this logic, then it becomes so diffused that one begins to wonder why it is called a method at all. At any rate, this is far too inconsistent with anything that Popper had in mind or implied. One has to conclude, therefore, that Popper's scientific method has at best restricted validity and can find no general application. Secondly, once Popper had rejected all inductive arguments, he was left with no justification for disallowing any theory. Indeed, Popper did not have any reason for thinking that his method of conjecture and refutation will tend to produce theories having greater verisimilitude. The clear implication is that even on his terms, for Popper science was an irrational activity. Two reasons can be adduced in favor of the claim that Popper was not really a rationalist even on his terms. First, the Popperian system rested on basis statements, the acceptance of which can never be rationally justified. Second, even if we disregard this problem, we must confront the fact that our scientific practice is wholly at odds with the prescription that we abandon theories simply because they mismatch observations. To be sure, Popper admits this. But he fails within his framework to spell out those conditions under which a theory out of tune with observations may still be retained. Again, his admission that basic statements are ungrounded can be read in two ways. One brings it fully within a certain kind of decisionism. The second takes it out of a foundationalist framework, opening up a space between a solid bedrock and a wholly mushy ground where anything goes. The trouble is that Popper does not much theorize this space and tends to move in a wholly conventionalist direction. This is not the place to make an argument, but there are times when Popper's account of theory choice resembles more and more the kind of strong relativist position that is much despised by his followers. One might say then that to get rid of the problems of inductivism, Popper landed straight in the lap of an equally pernicious deductivism. When in turn, he tried to rid himself of the problems inherent in this position, he slipped into an utterly indefensible and unreasonable irrationalism. Popper never adopted this second strategy explicitly. Indeed, through his life he resisted these moves, often holding stubbornly onto mistaken views but never renouncing his faith in science as a worthwhile and rational human activity. But critics were quick to employ this tension in his philosophy. By finding flaws in his philosophy, Feyerabend could argue, for example, against the possibility of rational scientific change and progress, and claim that neither inductive nor deductive logic permits the rejection of any hypothesis. In other words, in science just about anything goes. Drawing upon Popper's own ideas against truth and exploiting the implausibility of the notion of verisimilitude. Philosophers discarded the very distinction between true and false, paving the way for strong relativism. The history of human endeavor is replete with instances of people idealizing their practices, far removed from what they actually do. Scientists and philosophers of science too have succumbed to this temptation. Popper looked the first faltering steps towards amending and improving this picture, later rectified by a chastened Thomas Kuhn but lambasted beyond recognition by Feyerabend. It was important to make science look recognizably human, but philosophers such as Feyerabend were carried away so far that they made science look exactly like any other human activity. In an attempt to bring it down to earth, they finished with a picture of science where the very point and internal differentia of science was completely lost. Popper played an important role, without yielding to Feyerabendian temptations, in this transition from an idealized to a modest, unpretentious view of science. This may well be because he was too deeply trapped in the very idealization that he sought to dismantle. But it was also because he had the courage to defend science as an important part of general human flourishing. Philosophers and scientists will continue to learn as much from his insights as from his errors. Economic and Political Weekly, December 31, 1994.